What's up guys, and welcome back to the channel. I've gotten pretty caught up over in the machine shop, so I need to get back to work on this 07K build. Today I'm going to be reinstalling this girdle system, and I want to talk to you guys about that because I get quite a few inquiries for this, but I haven't typically been selling this to the public because it is such a pain to install. So my thoughts on that are, if I put a video out showing all the ins and outs of installing this, maybe I can start selling these to the public while educating you guys on what you're getting yourselves into. So let's have a look at everything it takes to get this girdle installed properly when you're building your engine. Okay, first let's talk about the machining that needs to take place when installing this girdle. So this is just sitting here, so I'm going to pull this off for a second. So there's quite a bit that needs to be done to this block above and beyond your typical engine build to make this girdle work. When you bolt this girdle up to the bottom end, it can move the block around a little bit. And so when you machine this block, you want to have that girdle bolted up solid as if the engine was bolted together. The reason for that is that we need to tunnel bore the mains here. All of these main caps basically get cut down. They get cut down on this surface here so that they bolt up tighter, and this bore gets smaller so it can be remachined. So this bore here gets pushed closer to the opposite side, and then we can remachine this bore so that everything is nice and true and straight when you assemble it with the new girdle on. A couple things need to happen before that takes place. So we use a larger main stud. The holes down in this block that the main studs go into actually get machined out. The main stud increases from a 9mm to a 10mm. So that's the first thing that needs to happen. Also, the holes in these main caps need to be increased in size so that the stud will fall through them. And then on top of that, we also add a 360-degree thrust bearing to this thrust main cap. So now it has, on the clutch side, it has a 360-degree thrust bearing that goes all the way around the circumference of both the block and the cap to give it a larger surface area and allow it to deal with the demands put on it by aftermarket clutches that have a lot higher pressure plate pressures. So that, I believe, is a must. These engines were never intended to make a lot of power, so the factory chose to only do a 180-degree thrust bearing, and the stock clutches in the 5-speeds are pretty soft, so it works fine in that application. But once we start increasing those pressures and things, that's something that needs to be upgraded. So that's the first thing that needs to happen. These caps get, on this face, no more than 3 thousandths. So you can take 1 to 2 thousandths off these surfaces to make that bore smaller, just enough to kiss it with a line bore to straighten the block back out with the girdle bolted on. So that's just the machining that needs to happen on the block. On my engines, I also increased the head stud size from 10mm to 11mm, and it's kind of the same process there. The head bolt holes in the block get machined out, tapped out for a bigger thread size, and then the head itself needs the bores for the bolts to be opened up a little bit. And then we have that increased head stud size that makes the head gasket retention better. And then we also have the main stud increase in size, which rigidifies the block, ties everything together, and makes this block a lot stronger. These blocks are kind of twisty by nature. They're pretty thin casting. So once you start getting up to that 600 or 700 horsepower mark, things start to twist and we start seeing fretting on the main bearings. So this girdle system increases that threshold quite a bit. We don't start seeing fretting on the bearings until around 1200 horsepower with this girdle installed correctly. So all of this machine work is done when the rest of the machine work is being done on the block. So if you're planning on building a forged out engine like this, you want to have all of your parts to assemble the engine ready to go, all the hardware, before you ever take it to a machinist. So when we do a block, the first thing we start with is opening up those threaded holes for both the main studs and the head studs. We cut the caps, the face of the caps. We install the girdle, torque everything to spec, and then the first operation on that block is to tunnel bore and hone all of these mains so that everything's straight and true with that girdle installed. Then the machine shop can use those bores to align the block to bore and hone the cylinders and deck the head surface. So if you are going to have something like this done, make sure you vet the machine shop that you're using and make sure that they think they can handle all of this work before you ever drop your engine off. So this block's obviously already done. It's already been a running engine, and we're just checking some bearings. We modified this oil pump, reinstalled the oil pump, reset the timing, so we're ready to start assembling again. I've already taken the time to clean all these sealing surfaces off and wipe them down with alcohol. So now it's time to install the girdle. But there is a lot of care that needs to be taken to get everything to seal correctly. So I'm gonna get everything ready to install here, and then we'll go through the whole process of installing this girdle. Okay, so obviously this flange surface needs to be sealed with RTV all the way around. And then we have the backing plate that goes on, and that needs to be sealed as well as maintain the distance here to the edge of the block so that the timing cover can go on. But if you look at this girdle, so all the studs are inside of the oil pan with the exception of the outer 4. So this bolt pattern here is the oil pan bolt pattern all the way around. But these 2 front studs and these 2 rear studs are basically outside of the oil pan, exposed to open air. Those studs there can actually become an oil leak. So when we install this girdle, we actually have these little O-rings that go on those outer studs. And those are a real pain to get in place because you have to get this oil pan down over the oil pump with these kind of barely on. And then you have to squeeze your little fingies in there and roll those O-rings up as you set this girdle down. So it's a real pain in the butt, and it's all got to happen pretty fast before RTV cures and things like that. I'm going to do my best to show you how I do that. It's not very easy. So we're going to start by adding a bead of RTV all the way around this surface. I'm just using Ultra Gray Permatex High Torque. Since this girdle does get torqued down fairly tight, we want to use the high torque stuff so it doesn't all squeeze out and it leaves a bit of a seal. Okay, so we've got a bead of RTV around here. Now it's time to install the girdle. So I have these studs just barely protruding out with the O-rings already on them because we need to put this girdle on kind of at an angle here, and then we spin it into place to get around the oil pump. I'm just going to let one side sit while I try to roll these O-rings up. And now the same with the back side. These ones are even harder because the timing chain's in the way. Okay, so got those on. I remembered correctly, it's a huge pain in the ass. But now we're gonna thread all the studs in, get this thing started to get seated down. We're gonna pull it all the way towards the front with the bolts in this front cover, and then we're gonna seal up this rear cover and make sure it's flush with the back of the block before we start tightening anything down. These studs do come with the kit. These are our own spec studs just for this application. So all the studs are in. These are our custom washers that go with the kit. So these get put on each stud. I purposely didn't wash these. I kept them a little bit oily. Okay, so all the washers are on. Now we've got these screws to put in the front cover that will help pull the girdle all the way towards the front and keep it flush with the block. As with anything, it's always a good idea to get every screw started before you start tightening anything down. And I'm gonna go ahead and start all these outer flange bolts too. And if you remember from the first video, we still need to torque this rod, so don't forget stuff, important stuff like torquing a rod bolts. I didn't want to torque it until we had this bottom end tied together so that we didn't move any of the bearings or anything like that inadvertently. Okay, so a little dab of assembly lube. I'm just going to use a little piece of welding wire to get the assembly lube around the threads a little bit. We don't want to get it under the head of the washer, so we're just going to carefully put it around the threads of each stud. The reason you don't want to get it underneath the head of the nut is because this assembly lubricant actually has solids in it. It'll kind of release torque over time. If you want some sort of a lubricant underneath the head of the nut to get more proper torque, just use like a regular motor oil, something that can leach out as you torque it. This assembly lube's a little bit thicker and it does have basically solid moly particles in it. Can actually keep the nut from seating out properly, so you won't actually have proper torque. And as that lubricant gets dissolved by the oil, you'll actually lose torque on the stud. All right, so now that we have the studs lubed, we're just gonna thread these nuts in. And these studs go to 65 foot-pounds. I'll probably do that in 3 stages. Probably do 20, 40, 65, something like that. But the first thing I need to look at once I get all these nuts on is where this girdle is positioned in relation to the back side of the block. Because like I said earlier, we can't have this protruding over the back side of the block once we put this rear flange on. So we want to double check and make sure that this is not protruding and it's going to seat out properly. And it looks to be just about perfect. So I'm going to just send it right there. So I'm going to start here with the main cap. I don't remember exactly what the stock torque sequence is, but basically we're going to go back and forth from the center out. This is 20 foot-pounds to start. So I just tightened that front cover. Now that I have these torqued down to 20 foot-pounds, now we're going to go up to 40 and redo the same sequence. Now we're going to 65. Now I'm going to go through and torque all these outer flange bolts to 25 foot-pounds. All right, now this flange needs to go on, and we need to seal all the way around this surface here with RTV. And in order to get this to set right, I've got a few of the cover bolts for the timing cover that I'm just going to use to hold it in place once I get the RTV in place, just to let it set up and cure with these bolts in there. Now I'm just going to use these 3 timing cover bolts to hold this in place, as well as these 2 factory oil pan bolts. This holds it down, these hold it in. I'm not going to go too crazy on this. I'm just going to barely snug everything, and then I'm going to let it set up overnight before I come back and put the rear timing cover on. So there we go. Girdle's all on the engine. I need to pull the timing tools off of the underside of the head there, and this crank tool, so I can rotate this crank a little bit to get to this cap so I can torque that. Those go to, I think, 95 foot-pounds, so pretty tight. So let me get that going. Cam lock tool. Cam lock tool. So now we can rotate this crank just slightly in order to torque this cap here. So I double checked the torque on these. They're actually 85 foot-pounds. So we're going to go to 45 foot-pounds and then to 85 foot-pounds. 45. The reason these are so high is they're the 625 bolts in the Wiseco boost lines. So these are like a 250 horsepower per cylinder rod. Pretty burly stuff. So it's about double the torque of your standard chromoly rod. So there we go, guys. Everything's bolted up, sealed up, torqued. These screws are temporary, holding it in place while the RTV sets up, but everything's there. So now we need to install the oil pickup and the oil pan, but I still need to modify that oil pan, so that's gonna have to wait for the next video. And we still need to install this cover, timing cover here. So I'll get that done tomorrow after this stuff sets up, and then we'll RTV that and then install that timing cover. So that's about it for today, guys. This bottom end's buttoned up. We still have to put all the ancillary stuff on. Got to put the turbo and everything back on, but we have to modify that oil pan first. So this is a pretty big step, and hopefully it helps you guys understand what's involved in installing this girdle or any aftermarket girdle for that matter, and all the things you have to think about in order to make that happen and be installed correctly. So I think that's about it for this video, guys. If you're liking this content, hit that subscribe button. Go follow my other social medias. Linear Power Systems everywhere. Let me know if you think installing this is too much for the general public, because it's a great product, but I don't really want to have to be like hand holding everybody, if that makes sense. Not to be a dick, I just don't have a lot of time. So anyway, hopefully you guys learned something, and we'll see you in the next video.